As Nigeria navigates through a year of significant economic reforms, landscape reveals a mixed bag of challenges and strategic initiatives aimed at stabilizing and fostering growth in various sectors. Now, in a recent report by PwC Network tagged Nigeria's Economic Outlook, Navigating Economic Reform, the key economic indicators show that Nigeria's GDP expanded by 2.98% in Q1 2024, a notable improvement from the 2.31% growth recorded in the same period last year. However, there are inhibitors like inflation, depreciation of the naira, monetary and fiscal policies of government, debts, and the likes. And this morning, we're asking a very pivotal question. Are there ways to deal with these setbacks? Live in our studio, I have Abiodun Kayode Alli, Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory Services, PwC Nigeria. Thank you so much, Abiodun, for coming to our studio to talk about this.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Leko.
So I'm looking at the reports coming from your firm. It highlighted strong performances in finance and mining, including quarry. Can you elaborate on the specific subsectors actually driving growth within these broad categories?
Yeah, thank you. So that comment was actually coming from the report released by the National Bureau of Statistics for the first quarter of 2024. And from there, we could see that the financial service sector, like you said, as well as mining and quarry. Specifically to your question, the sectors in the financial service sector, I mean, your guess would be as good as mine. The banking sector did very well. Its growth rate was outstanding, right? Then followed by the insurance sector. But it was majorly the banking sector that did great. And this is quite understandable given the fact that we have a high interest environment. So we would be expecting things like their interest income to be on the increase, even though there is the downside that given the high loan to deposit ratio, there is the possibility of an increase in defaults as well. But their performance from interest income saw improvement. Then further also was the benefit that came to them from the liberalization of the foreign exchange rate, which actually saw the naira actually move from the exchange rate, right? Actually move from somewhere within the range of 450 naira to the dollar to somewhere currently at 1,400 naira to the dollar. So given the fact that most of these financial service sectors, they own foreign denominated assets, by the time you revalue most of these assets, there were significant gains that they got from there, right? Then also with respect to the mining and quarrying sector, we had Nigeria, I think for the first time in a long while, actually was able to turn around its growth rate in terms of crude mining, right? Mining of crude oil. And this was simply explained by the increase in crude oil production. Albeit, we know that even this increase itself is below what we have as our OPEC quota. I think we're currently doing somewhere within the range of 1.2, if not lower. Our OPEC quota in recent times has been 1.5 million barrels per day, right? And even what we had in our budget for 2024 was 1.78 million barrels per day. It's still low, but there was a significant improvement, right? And you know the reasons are due to things like theft, crude oil theft, insecurity, right? So these are some of the things that I think Nigeria needs to do more, right, in order to actually ensure that our growth in the crude oil sector, in the oil sector, is actually improved. Because even though we've seen a growth, a reversal of the negative growth we've been having, we've seen a positive growth, Nigeria should be doing way more than that. And the implication of this little growth you've seen, even though it has helped us to a slight extent, I think that if we can do better, it would help us more, especially in terms of foreign exchange, given the fact that our reserves are currently dwindling. So that's it, the answer to the question you asked.
Okay, so Abiodun, are there any major or any form of concern about the sustainability of this growth, most especially now in the financial sector? You've talked about the high interest rate environment, but then if you have been following the trend, it's discovered that there have been stories flying around about some banks that they're edging towards a liquidation or total collapse. Of course, you're privy to the information around Heritage Bank and what happened that actually took a lot of people by surprise. So are there concerns that we should be looking out for? Does it still look positive for these banks when you look at the capacity and the operations?
Yeah, so and that's a very good question, Likon. So I don't think it's much of a concern because the central bank, right, under the leadership of Yemi Cardoso, what they are trying to do is to sterilize the financial environment, right? Given the fact that they've come up with the recapitalization policy, right, which is actually to ensure that they actually have a strong backing, right? And we've seen some of these banks approaching the capital markets, issuing shares, right, just to ensure that they have that strong backing. So I think the current leadership of the CBN is actually doing well in terms of ensuring that Nigerians can be at rest in terms of the concerns of the financial service sector. So I wouldn't say that there is a concern from that perspective. The only concern I would see is, we've had a high loan to deposit ratio whereby you're expected to give about 65%. It was initially 65%. You're expected to give about 65% of loans that are being collected, right? You're expected to give it out, right? Lend to the real sector. It's a strategy to actually ensure there is expansion of credit. But given the fact that it's a high interest environment, right? How many people can actually afford to pay back this interest? So we might see a situation whereby there will be an increase in default. But even though despite the fact that it's been cut down to 50% recently, I think this might still be something to be concerned about, right? But by and large, in general, I don't think it's much of a concern from the financial service sector. From the oil and gas sector, the mining and quarrying, right, I do think there is a concern. For me, the mere fact that that sector actually grew by a slight percentage, right, the mere fact that it grew is not something to be joyful about. Like I said, I think a lot needs to be done because we have these resources, right? It's just about harnessing it and ensuring that the whole interest of the people is actually put at the forefront, as opposed to the interest of a few people who are actually sabotaging the efforts of increasing our crude oil production. And given the fact that crude oil prices are currently stable within the range of $79 per barrel, $80 per barrel, I think Nigeria actually needs a lot of revenue from expanding its production. So these are my two concerns for those sectors, Lekon.
Well, we are going to be talking about that in our next conversation on this show, looking at about additional 17 licenses that is to be put into play, of course, by the Nigerian government. But then, Abiodun, now the report mentioned food inflation leading the surge. For you, what specific factors would you say are responsible, or would you say are contributing to such high food inflation? And what would you say about government's initiatives to address these factors, if there are any at all?
Yeah, the food inflation is actually very concerning, right? I mean, even though we have it 40%, slightly higher, right? Food is something, the experience of people in the market actually shows that it's way higher than that, right? So basically, the factors that are responsible for food inflation, we've said it time and time again, right? And I think more recently, given the high cost of things like tomato, pepper, right? I think the seasonality of the product, these commodities, is actually what is causing the current increase that we're experiencing, right? So June is a period of the month whereby we've always had an increase in the price of tomatoes and peppers. And that's simply because it's a wet season, right? And it doesn't favor the cultivation of these crops. So these are one of the factors that we're seeing. Then in Nigeria, we've also had a huge incidence, right, of spoilage of most of these products when we look at the farm to the gate, right, to the market, right, moving these things right from where they are produced to where they are going to be bought, right? We've had situations whereby most of these items, Nigeria has one of the highest rates of items that actually perish while in the move, right, to the market, right? Most of these items, 50% of it actually gets bad, right, in trying to move them. So we have to do a lot when it comes to preservation of these items. That's a given, right? Then also, if you look at the road networks that we have in Nigeria, it's quite worrisome, and it's something that needs to be heavily we need a huge investment in that area. So these are some of the things that can actually mitigate its impact. Apart from that, other food items that we have in the country, we import most of these items, right? Most of the items used in making staple things like bread, right? And given the logistics concerns as well as the impact of the foreign exchange rate, right? Especially when it comes to importing of the items used in its productions. These are some of the things that need to be dealt with. And I think it's something that the government should actually pay key attention to, because it seems like there is a lot of priority, how would I call it? There's a lot of mispriority, right? So I think this is something government needs to focus on currently.
Well, of course, we know that the CBN raised the NPR to combat inflation, but that seems not to have had any impact in curbing price increases. So are there alternatives or probably complementary monetary policy measures that should be considered by the Apex Bank?
Yeah, and that's a good point you've mentioned. I'm sure we've said this, and I'm sure a lot of analysts have also said this on your show, that the reason the NPR might not necessarily solve the problem of inflation in Nigeria, particularly because it's not, the problem of inflation is not driven by the expansion of a proper credit system in Nigeria, right? It's more due to structural challenges. So some of the things that I think measures that can be adopted by the CBN is, to be honest with you, more of a moral suasion, right? Moral suasion, giving instructions to banks to try and support the agricultural sector, because definitely the purpose of the bank is financial intermediation, but the monies that are being kept by these banks, they can actually lend more of it to the financial sector, right? Sorry, to the agricultural sector. So in this way, I think it would actually help in expanding credit, right? And I think one other thing that the CBN has done, which is quite good, is to actually move away from focusing its priorities on development initiatives, right? Most of the initiatives that the former administration were doing, especially with respect to focusing on agriculture, I think it was a good move for the CBN to actually leave that duty and responsibility to the development institutions to actually take that role. Then I think one other key thing that the central bank has done in conjunction with the federal government is distributing most of the fertilizers that were acquired by the past administration. I think that distribution is quite key to actually assist farmers right now in order to help them increase their productivity. But by and large, I think the CBN has done quite a lot. I'm looking forward to seeing a complementary move from the fiscal side. Leko.
Okay, so one thing they've actually said that is key and has been affecting all sectors is the Naira depreciation. We've seen the Apex Bank try as much as possible to shore that line, but it seems not to be yielding fruits in terms of policies being put on board. Without having to necessarily dwell on the impact, because you actually mentioned, you've talked about it in passing, but then what are the steps that you feel should be taken to shore up the value of the Naira? Currently, like you said, Nigeria is not actually producing as much for exports, and even the major export, which is crude, in terms of production levels, has dwindled over the course of the months. So are there areas or things that you think the Nigerian government can do in order to improve or deal with the issue around Naira depreciation?
Yeah, thank you, Liko. And that's a fantastic question. And that's the concern for most individuals and businesses, firms right now. A lot more needs to be done in, we've said this over and time and again, right, that a lot more needs to be done in removing bottlenecks, right, addressing bottlenecks. The government cannot in its own help is not meant for business, right? Government is actually not meant for business, but individuals and firms who are actually going into business, what government can do is to try as much as possible to get out of the way, right? To ensure that these people are able to do their business. Like you said, we can increase the value of the Naira if we export more. But before we export, we need to produce, and our productivity needs to be on the high, right? There is a lot of times whereby most of the items we actually produce, they get bad. So take, for instance, Nigeria is one of the highest producers of cassava. Nigeria is one of the highest producers of maize worldwide, right? But by the time you want to look at the exports, there's a lot of bottleneck in exporting these items, right? And by the time we even end up exporting these items, thanks to some of the provisions made available, like I think the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, right, whereby you can export most of these items to the US duty-free, right? By the time we want to export most of these items, we see that by the time they get there, they are actually bad, right, and they are no longer good for consumption. So a lot more needs to be done in actually helping with the quick exportation of these items. A lot more needs to be done in actually ensuring that there is that enabling environment to kind of scale production of most of these items. So Basically, it's all about getting the roadblocks out of the way and also ensuring that there is that enabling environment to ensure that most of the items or productivity is increased and most of the items being produced, they have a longer shelf life, right? They're able to last longer. So I think government can help in this area of exports. I think one other area, which I'm sure we all know, has to do with our road networks, right? Our road networks as well as our power infrastructure. I think if we focus more on this, we can actually help with production. Then also with crude oil, like you said, if we can address the issue of security, right? And if we can address the issue of most of these interests, which I keep saying, right, vested interest, right? Few individuals who are actually holding the nation to ransom. I think we can do more in increasing our crude oil production and thereby getting foreign exchange reserves. Then finally, the last one that comes to mind would be in terms of our services, right? So, and I know the current fiscal policy and Tax Reform Committee are working on it, right, in addressing most of the issues that would actually help our individuals export services without actually causing a kind of problem for non-resident companies. Nigerians are talented, right? The service sector is one that holds huge potential. I think there's a lot more that we can do to actually kind of liberalize this sector. And it's something I look forward to seeing in the second half of this year. So those are my thoughts on your questions.
All right. So finally, Abiodun, interestingly, in a lot of these conversations that we've been having, the reports detail the surge in revenue collection. We know that this administration is very keen on raking in more revenue from taxes. So then for you, what's your take as regards that? And what other factors would you say increased the revenue lines? And can it even be sustained?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I like the question of sustenance, right? So first of all, I would say that it's not, technology can be one of the reasons for the increase, right? Technologies and probably tax audits, right? And also some of the extensions that the tax authorities are putting in place to actually capture the activities of non-resident companies. So I think these are some of the things that are leading to the increase in tax collections that we saw in the first quarter of the year. Can it be sustained? I think it can, especially with the fact that the government has put round pegs in round holes by ensuring that someone who knows well about tax administration, who knows well about tax policies has come to hold that area, that aspect. I think government can actually do well in that. But I think one thing is critical. If you are able to create that environment that actually sees prosperity, because taxes come from profits, right? If these companies are not making profits, you won't get any tax to collect. And we've seen instances where some of these companies are leaving the country, right? So these are losses, right? Future losses even to the country. So I think one thing that is quite key is that government needs to focus on ensuring prosperity of all by putting in place most of these things that I've said, basic amenities, infrastructure. Once these things are in place, right, and also giving opportunities for small businesses to grow and thrive, then, and also encouraging them to become formalized and organized. Once all these are in place, you'll begin to see profits, right? And from those profits, you get your taxes. Those are some of the thoughts I have with respect to taxation.
This discussion is actually getting interesting. We may need to speak more, Abiodun, because I noticed that in the reports, one other thing that was mentioned was the issue around debt securitization and restructuring. So I'd like to find out how effective have these strategies been when it comes to securitizing, looking at the debt management now of Nigeria, the various steps that have been taken to manage the debts. Of course, we know that it's around 120 trillion naira now. But you look at the service costs also is also adding to what Nigeria would have to pay back to its creditors. So do you have concerns as regards this in terms of management and the rising debt burden that Nigeria keeps plunging itself into, without the fact that where Nigeria is actually putting the money into seems not to be reaping in terms of revenue benefits and, of course, improving the fiscal portfolio of the country?
Yeah, and that's a very touchy subject right now, right? The current debt burden is quite high. The over 120 trillion. It's quite high, right? It's been an astronomical increase, right, in the last decade. But one thing I'm going to give the Debt Management Office kudos for is that most of the bonds, right, most of the bonds that were taken, they've done well in ensuring that repayment doesn't take place until a very long time. So we have enough we not have enough time to generate the needed revenue to pay back that debt, right? Most of them are going to be matured maybe in 2050, right? So that's better when you compare us with our peers like Ghana, who actually have seen themselves defaulting on most of their debts, right? So that's one good thing I would give to the government currently. But yes, it is a concern for me that we're increasing the debt and we're not generating sufficient revenue to pay back the debt, right? So I think the government needs to do more to focus on how it's spending the debt. Like in your last program, right, like the speaker said, it's quite important that we tie most of these debts to critical infrastructure that can generate the needed revenue. So I think it's something that the stakeholders, public stakeholders actually need to hold the government accountable with respect to how it's actually spending most of these things, right? I mean, there are a lot of times government has not proved itself to be efficient in terms of spending. So I think it's up to the public to actually look into exactly and hold the government accountable with how it's spending most of these monies. Leko.
Well, we know that the IMF has actually projected that there would be positive growth in terms of Nigeria's economy between over 2 and 3%, but a lot needs to be done, as you have said, Abiodun, if we're hoping to achieve that, looking at our economy. Abiodun Kayode Alli, Senior Manager, Tax and Regulatory Services, PwC Nigeria, thank you so much for your time and, of course, for sharing your thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Leko.